G'day history lovers, it's me, Random History, and today we're going to be doing the part 2 of the downfall of the Anglo-Saxon kings. This will be the final part, and we'll cover the battles of Stamford Bridge and the Battle of Hastings in as much detail as possible, so without further ado, let's get into it. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, that's right, Harald Hardrada and his claim to the English throne. Like I mentioned in part 1, Harold was a descendant of Canute the Great, who was one of the Danish kings of England and therefore believed he was entitled to the English throne. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada, with some 7,000 to 9,000 men transported by about 300 ships, landed along the coastline of England, where he then linked up with Scottish and Flemish troops led by none other than Tostig Godwinson, Harold Godwinson's brother. In case you'd forgotten, Tostig was bitter with England and his brother after he was exiled in 1065 due to not accepting a revolt against him as Earl of Northumbria. It is said that Harold was actually the one that persuaded the king to exile his brother. It is likely his motives for doing so were that he wished to maintain peace in Northumbria and saw that his brother would never be able to keep his earldom, as well as the country would remain unified to defend against a possible foreign invasion. In the late summer of 1066, the invaders, which were now made up of roughly 11,000 men, including Tostig's Flemish and Scottish mercenaries, sailed up the River Ouse before advancing on the city of York. The subsequent Battle of Fulford, which took place on the 20th of September 1066, would prove to be a decisive turning point in English history, and quite possibly the point where Harold Godwinson's fate was sealed. The English, being led by Earls Edwin and Morcar, struck first, attacking the Norwegian army before it could fully deploy, which led to some initial success for the English, as Morcar's troops managed to push Harold's back into the marshland surrounding the battlefield. In defence, Harold sent in superior and more fresh troops to engage the weakened Anglo-Saxons. At the same time, Harold brought more of his troops from the right flank to attack the centre and sent more men to the river, which had once flowed, separating the two armies until it dried up, which led to the initial English attack. The Norwegian army attacked the English centre from the flank, led by Harald Hardrada himself, who was said to have cut down any men in his way. The subsequent pressure from this forced the Anglo-Saxons to give more and more ground, resulting in Edwin's forces, who had been defending the bank of the river, being cut off from the rest of the army. Now being cut off from the main part of the army, Edwin's remaining forces fled back to the city of York for a last stand. Now vastly outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the defending Anglo-Saxon army was defeated. However, both Edwin and Morcar somehow managed to survive the battle. After this defeat, York would surrender to the Norwegians under the promise that the victors would not force entry to their city, perhaps because Tostig didn't wish for his capital to be looted. After it was arranged that various hostages would be brought in, as well as some money, the Norwegian army retired to Stamford Bridge, some 11 kilometres east of the city. It is unclear how many were killed in the Battle of Fulford, but it is estimated there were as many as 750 English killed, with as many as 900 Norwegians also being cut down. Upon hearing of this resounding defeat, Harold, who had previously been in southern England awaiting an invasion from Normandy and William the Conqueror, marched his troops day and night to take out the Viking threat, arriving at Stamford Bridge in just 6 days. According to Snorri Sturluson, who was a 13th century Icelandic historian, before the battle a single man rode up alone to Hardrada and Tostig. He gave no name, but spoke to Tostig, offering to return his earldom if he would turn against Hardrada. In response, Tostig asked what his brother Harold would be willing to give Hardrada for his trouble, to which the rider responded, 7 feet of English ground, as he is taller than other men. Then the unnamed rider rode back to the Saxon host. It is said Hardrada was impressed by the rider's boldness and asked Tostig who he was. Tostig replied that the rider was none other than Harold Godwinson himself. You might be asking yourself, if Harold Godwinson was right there, and Tostig knew it was him, why didn't he just have him killed, seeming that would end his fight for the English throne in just a few minutes? It is unclear why, if this story is to be believed, but if it is true, I believe it could be down to the fact that Tostig still had some love for his brother, or that he didn't want to kill him dishonorably, or something like that. Make sure to let me know what you guys think of that story, and whether you think it's true or not in the comments, because I'd definitely be interested in hearing your guys' opinions, because I'm not 100% on it myself. I think it definitely could have been true, but it's sort of unclear. Like, it could go either way in my eyes. The sudden arrival of the English army surprised Hardrada and Tostig, who were not expecting a fight and had only brought light arms to their camp, whilst the English were fully armed. The English advance was stopped at the choke point of the bridge, which separated the main forces of the armies, which was famously said to have been held by a single giant Norse axeman, who single-handedly held up the entire English army, killing up to 40 Englishmen in the process, until eventually he was speared in the groin by some English soldiers who had swum underneath the bridge with a spear. This delay allowed the stunned Norsemen to form a shield wall to face the English attack. After that beast of a man was killed, Harold's army poured across the bridge, forming a line just short of the Norse, and charged. After hours of battle, the Norse army, unequipped for such a large-scale battle, and not to mention with roughly half their men defending their ships, began to fracture, allowing the English troops to force their way in and break up the shield wall. Now completely outflanked, and with their king Harald Hardrada slain by an arrow through his windpipe whilst fighting ferociously in typical Viking berserker fashion, as well as Tostig, their other leader, also being slain in the battle at some point, the army disintegrated and was virtually annihilated. In the later stages of the battle, the Norwegians who had been guarding the ships at Rikal, led by Eystein Ore, who was actually Hardrada's son-in-law, arrived fully armed but completely exhausted, with reports of some men actually dying of exhaustion upon reaching the battlefield, launched a counter-attack, which actually briefly halted the English advance, but they were soon overwhelmed, with Ore being slain in the process. And with that, the battle was over, a resounding English victory. It is said that so many died in an area so small that the field was still whitened by bleached bones 50 years after the battle took place. It is unclear exactly how many men died in total, however it is estimated as high as a whopping 8,000 plus of the 9,000 Norwegians either died or were missing, with only 24 of the original 300 ships being needed to sail the remaining Norwegians home. On the English side, it is also unclear, however the only estimate I could find names it at around 5,000, but take that with a grain of salt. After his huge victory at Stamford Bridge, Harold began moving his forces south, although a substantial number would remain in Northumbria, including Morcar and Edwin. It is unclear when exactly Harold learned of William's landing, but it was most likely whilst he was travelling south with his army. Harold stopped his march in London for about a week to gather some more men and just regroup, before marching his army to Hastings where William had set up camp. On the night of October 13th, Harold set up a camp at Caldbeck Hill, near what was described as a hoar apple tree, hoar meaning grey, and it most likely refers to an apple tree covered with lichen, which would have served as a local landmark. The camp was about 9.7 kilometres or 6 miles away from William's castle at Hastings. The exact number of soldiers involved in the battle is unknown, as sources of the time are clearly very overplayed or very underplayed, with the Norman reports putting the English army with about 400,000 to 1.2 million men, with the Anglo-Saxon reports generally giving very low figures for Harold's army, so it's clear that, for lack of a better term, these reports were bullshit. Modern historians tend to agree that the English army was probably around 7,000 to 8,000 troops, including Harold's two surviving brothers, Gurth and Leofwine. As for the Normans, most historians believe that it was roughly the same as Harold's army, with around 8,000 to 10,000 men, with some 2,000 to 3,000 of them being cavalry on the higher end of the estimates, with the lower end estimates being set at about 7,000 to 8,000 men, with 1,000 to 2,000 of them being cavalry. When it came to weaponry and the such, the Normans had a huge advantage over the Anglo-Saxon army, due to the Anglo-Saxon army consisting entirely of infantry, whilst William had archers and cavalry at his disposal. The battle began at 9 AM on Saturday, the 14th of October 1066, with William's archers firing at the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, which had set up at the top of a steep slope with its flanks protected by woods and marshy ground. Sources differ on the exact site that the English fought on. Some state it was at the site of the abbey nearby, with some newer sources suggesting it was at Caldbeck Hill still. Regardless of exactly where they were, the only thing that really matters is that they were set up on a hill. The initial flurry of arrows had little effect upon the English, mainly due to the fact that the archers were shooting uphill, which meant that most of the arrows either bounced off the shield wall or overshot their targets and flew over the top of the hill. The lack of English archers also hampered the Norman archers, as there were no English arrows to be gathered up and reused. After the attack from the archers, if you can even call it that, it basically did nothing. William sent the spearmen forward to attack the English. The English met them with a barrage of missiles as they tried to work their way up the hill. Not arrows, but spears, axes, and even stones. The spearmen were unable to force openings in the shield wall, so the cavalry advanced in support. The cavalry was so badly mauled by the English infantry, many of whom were wielding two-handed axes, that it fled, and William's army began to rout. To make matters worse, there was a rumour spreading amongst the men that William had been killed, which only hastened their retreat. Upon hearing of this, it is said that William rode through his forces, showing his face and yelling that he was still alive and not dead. He then led a counter-attack against the English forces, who, thinking the battle had been won, chased down the Normans, a charge which was possibly led by Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine. As the Norman forces turned back around and launched their counter-attack, some of the English rallied on a hillock before being overwhelmed. The Bayeux tapestry depicts the deaths of both Gurth and Leofwine just before the hillock was overrun. but it is also possible they may have died later on in the battle, as their bodies were found right next to Harold's after the battle. If they did die earlier on like the Bayeux Tapestry shows, it is possible their bodies could have been brought to Harold, which may have influenced him to stay and fight until the end. However, it is unclear what actually happened. It is also unclear whether or not Harold actually ordered the pursuit of the fleeing Normans, or if it was spontaneous and out of his control. Robert Wace, a medieval Norman poet, claims that Harold had indeed ordered his men to stay in their formations, but no other account of the battle gives this detail. A lull most likely occurred in the early afternoon, and a break for rest and food would probably have been needed. It is possible William used this momentary slowing of pace to implement a new strategy, most likely inspired by the earlier success of the false routing. His plan was that if he could bait the English into more pursuits, breaks in the English line might form which they could then exploit. As the intense fighting resumed, William implemented his strategy with devastating effects at least twice. It is said that 2 or 3 of William's horses were killed under him during the never-ending cavalry charges. The defence, tiring and now becoming outnumbered, began to break down, with Harold Godwinson said to have been killed late during the battle in the late afternoon when he was struck by an arrow through the eye, killing him instantly. The now leaderless English army began to collapse, with many of them fleeing, but not the brave soldiers of the royal household, who upon Harold's death gathered around his body and fought to the last man. With that, the battle was over. It is unclear once more exactly how many men perished in the fighting, but it is speculated that roughly 2,000 Normans fell, with the English suffering double that amount, with some 4,000 men being killed. William the Conqueror was crowned king on Christmas Day 1066, some 2 months after the battle, due to a relatively small-scale resistance against him led by Morcar and Edwin after the Battle of Hastings. William's reign was plagued by rebellions by the unhappy English people, but he managed to keep his title, and the Anglo-Saxon kings would eventually fade into memory. So that's the story of the downfall of the Anglo-Saxon kings. I had a really good time researching this one, so I hope you guys enjoyed this 2-part series as much as I did. If you did, make sure to leave a like, and if you had any suggestions for future videos, constructive criticism, or wanted to discuss something you found interesting, please do so in the comments, as I would love to hear from you guys. Anyways, that's going to be it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.